Thanks for stopping by to check out yet another episode of Vintage Audio Review. In this episode, I'm going to talk about, you guessed it, the Carver C-4000T Holographic Stereo Preamplifier. In 1985, Carver sold this for $1,199, which in today's money would be about $5,500. Quite a bit of money for a preamp. This thing has a lot of features, and we'll zoom in on them in just a moment, as well as the back panel, and then take a tour on the inside. And then of course talk about the specs and how I think it sounded. One thing I'm going to point out right off the beginning that just bothers the heck out of me, why anybody in their right mind would do this, but if you notice, both sides have been trimmed. I will show a closer view of that, but whoever owned this at one point decided it wouldn't fit in the rack that he had, so he sloppily ground off both sides. And I do have the handles for them. There are some like rack mount kind of handles that you could grab onto. They still fit on there. However, this bozo just ground off the side with maybe one of those Harbor Freight bench grinders or something, because it's not straight. So anyway, that being said, we'll get into some of the functions up front. So here's a better view of the front of the C-4000T. I believe the T designation means that it has a tube transfer function characteristic somehow. We'll start off over here on the left. We have a nice volume control and a nice big balance control. Here we have a headphone jack. Now, I rarely check these. I don't listen to headphones, so it's like an afterthought to me, but this does have a headphone jack. It does have a Sonic Holography button. It has a time lens button, and the time lens button, when engages the digital time lens. It adds some kind of a delay feature, I believe, to the signals. You also have an auto correlator button, which has to do with reducing noise. We have the Sonic Holography button right here, and there is a button right here which is for Sonic Holography, which engages either the theoretical mode or the normal mode. We also have our power on-off switch here, and we have two buttons here for the surround sound feature. I didn't investigate a lot of the functions of this unit. I was mainly interested in how it would work as a two-channel preamp. We also have, for the surround sound, you have an ambience feature and a surround level here. So there is a control for the correlation, and the level is here. So these two relate to the correlation feature, which helps to reduce the high frequency noise. We do have individual bass and treble controls. The treble is here for the right side, the left side treble's here, left bass here, right bass here. We have two tape monitor switches here. We also have a dubbing switch. There's two of them. We also have a switch to switch in an external processor. And we do have an infrasonic switch there, which puts in a filter. If we want to use the tone controls, we would depress that. We also have an 8 kilohertz filter switch. We have a 40 kilohertz filter switch. We also have a preamp gain switch. When that's pressed in, you get 10 dB of gain. We also have a stereo mono switch. So this right here is this output minus 15 dB. That would be a muting switch. And we have a speakers on-off switch, which cuts the signal going to the two preamp outputs. Our function switch is right here. We have a moving magnet position. We have a moving coil position. We have a CD tuner and video aux position. So it does have two different phono preamp capabilities. And I just wanted to show one of the edges here. You can tell it's nice and shiny where the guy ground it off, and it's not an even grind, and it's sharp edges, so you would want to be careful handling this unit. I wanted to give a little bit better description of what the manual says in regards to some of these features here. The external processor that engages an outboard signal processor such as an equalizer. The selected processing affects signals being heard on recordings being made, and that is the external processor switch right there. The infrasonic filter is right there, and when engaged it eliminates unwanted signal energy below 20 Hertz. The 8 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz switch right there. That alters the turnover frequency of the treble controls, and it broadens the treble control range when depressed. The 40 Hz loudness switch right there alters the turnover frequency of the bass controls, and it broadens the bass control range when depressed. The dub switches over here, dub 1 to 2 or 2 to 1, allows copying of recordings from tape 1 to tape 2 or vice versa. When both dub buttons are out, the signal chosen by the input selector is fed to the tape decks. The stereo mono switch there, it combines the two channels when engaged. So you're going to get an output from both the left and the right channel. The speakers off button mutes the main output signals from the preamplifier without affecting the headphone or time delay outputs. The auto correlator button, that engages the auto correlator noise reduction circuit. The correlation auto threshold, which is right here, when engaged, the auto correlator self-adjusts to noise level in program. Adjacent LED illuminates in automatic mode. When the button is out, the threshold is set by the correlation threshold manual control, which is over here. And they're talking about the LED over here. There is also a low frequency cowl, which requires a small screwdriver. That sets the threshold of the low frequency hum and rumble filter in the auto correlation system. The time lens, that engages the digital time lens, which is, there's our digital time lens. The Hall ambience switch right there. The Hall ambience allows the user to adjust rear channel separation from mono to full stereo. The holographic injection ratio, which is right there, alters the holographic image. The theoretical setting produces a more dramatic wraparound, while the normal setting button out is preferred with well-mic'd recordings. So the surround sound buttons are here. It activates the surround sound circuits to reproduce ambience via side rear speakers. Concert slope, which is right here, adjusts the length of the time delay to vary the spatial quality of the ambience. Surround level, left, adjusts the relative volume of the left channel of the ambient signal, i.e. the ratio of the ambient to direct sound, and the surround sound right adjusts the relative volume of the right channel of the ambient signal. There are two surround sound level controls. There is the left one here and the right one down here, and they adjust the relative volume of the specific channel of the ambient signal, i.e. the ratio of the ambient to direct sound. So that's used for surround sound processing. Coming around the back of the 4000T, we have 3 switched outlets and 3 unswitched outlets. I should point out that there is no separate fuses for any of these outlets. The only fuse is a 1/4 amp fuse right there, and that is to protect the internal circuitry of the 4000T. Here are our surround sound outputs, which would go to a separate amplifier. Over here we have our input section, and we have our moving magnet phono input, which has some different capacitive loading choices, 0 puff, 180 puff, and 390 puff. The moving coil input is right here, CD, tuner, video aux. And then you have your 2 tape inputs, and we have the external processor input there. Now I like the way that Carver broke out the outputs in this section, so there's no tape in, out, record, monitor. So here's our tape output for 1 and 2 right there, our external processor output. And then we have 2 main outputs, which is another nice feature that Carver has. You can use 2 of them. There is also an option to go in and modify the circuitry so that one could be down a few dB more than the other one if you wanted. And of course, here is our phono ground input. Here we have the inside of the C4000T. And we'll start off this little board right here. This is the power supply. So here's one of the boards. And it's just kind of a general view. So here we have a little bit different view of the inside of the C4000T. There are a lot of circuit boards in this guy. This is yet another view of the inside of the C4000T, and I wanted to point out this board right here. You can kind of see that is the motherboard that all the other boards plug into, and This is a little bit of a bear to work on, to say the least. There is a headphone jack that needs to be unscrewed from the faceplate and unsoldered. And yet one more angle of the inside of the C4000T. Our first piece of data is the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for a 2 volt input and a 2 volt output, so there's 0 dB gain. We can see that the SNR is great at 100 dB. The THD is looking pretty good at, we'll call it 0.06%. Now the THD plus noise is at 65 dB, which is a bit higher than what I would like, but overall still it's looking pretty good to start off with. I should mention that all the measurements are taken with the tone controls bypassed and the 10 dB gain switch off. Here's the SNR THD plot at 1 kilohertz with the volume control set to a maximum and only a 50 millivolt signal input. So you can see we're getting about 15 dB of gain. Our distortion is really good and the THD plus noise has improved and the SNR has dropped down a bit, but it's also at max volume gain. And here we have the frequency response plots for a 2 volt input and a 2 volt output, and the channels are balanced within 0.1 dB or less, and the frequency response is down about 0.8 dB at 20 kilohertz. Here we have the SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for a CD input with a 1 volt signal going into it, and we can see that we've got just a tad over 15 dB of gain. Our distortion is less than 0.05% and the SNRs are greater than 100 dB. This graph shows the effects of turning the treble or bass controls to a minimum or a maximum. There is also a plot for the tone control on but set flat, and you can tell that it's fairly flat except for at about 10 kilohertz it starts dropping off till it's down about maybe 2.5 dB at 20 kilohertz. So if you selected the tone controls to be on and all of them are flat, on this particular preamp it is going to have a bit of an effect on the high end. This piece of data shows what happens when you press in one of the different effects on the C4000, the hologram or adding 10 dB of gain or putting in the infrasonic filter. So it kind of just shows you what happens to the frequency response when you set one of those to the in position. This plot shows the crosstalk between the left and right channels. In this case, there is an input applied to the left channel and the right channel's input is terminated into a load, basically a short. And what we are seeing is the amount of leakage of the left channel into the right channel. And we have anywhere from 50 dB to as little as 35 dB of isolation between the two channels. Here is a frequency response plot for what happens when you switch in the time lens effect. Here is the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for a 5 millivolt signal applied to the moving magnet phono input, and the volume adjusted so that there is about 500 millivolts at the output. Now there is a specification for an SNR of better than 89 dB, and we're 16 dB shy of that. However, our THD is looking pretty good. We've got about 40 dB gain, and the THD plus noise is about 70 dB, so that's looking pretty good. Here we have the frequency response plot for the moving magnet phono input as it's measured at the tape monitor output with a 5 millivolt signal applied and 0 puff loading. There is a specification of 0.25 dB from being flat, and basically we are 1.76 dB, so we are failing the flatness requirements. Here is the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for the moving coil
phono input with 0.5 millivolts applied to it, and the volume adjusted to give 0.5 volts at the output, or 500 millivolts at the output of the preamp. And there is a specification for SNR. It's supposed to be greater than 84 dB, and we're 30 dB worse than that. The bright side is the THD is looking pretty good, and the gain is looking pretty good, but most of the problem is due to the 60 hertz hum coming through with that high of gain, and that is probably something that could be helped with some filter capacitor replacements. Here we have the frequency response of the moving coil phono input with 0.5 millivolts applied to it, and the specification calls out for 0.25 dB flatness. Basically, it is probably 2.5 dB of flatness across the band. If you just ignored the area below 100 hertz, it is not so bad, maybe plus or minus half a dB or so.
I should mention that my good buddy Ian, episode 5, had asked if I wanted to check out a Carver C4000T that he had picked up, and this is that unit. I originally hooked it up to my audio analyzer and thought it looked okay, but needed a little work with some of these switches and volume controls. So I disassembled it, which is a royal pain in the butt. One trick is that this headphone jack screws to this front panel, so you need to unsolder the 2 wires that go to the headphone jack, and then you can unscrew this, and then you can remove this front panel, which you need to do in order to get at some of the circuit boards. So once I had figured that out, I was able to clean some of the contacts where the connectors on the circuit board go into the motherboard. I did find a couple of solder joints on the power supply board that I dressed up, and I did clean all the controls, all the pots anyway, not the switch controls. And once I did that, I went in and measured it, and it seemed more stable. That being said, for my listening test on the C4000T, I still had the Conrad Johnson MF-200 power amplifier, so I hooked that up to my KEF 107 speakers, and I hooked this up and listened to it for quite a while, trying different functions, and overall I would have no problems using this as my everyday 2-channel preamplifier. I didn't really go into any of the surround sound stuff. I don't think that's really relevant for today unless you were just dying to use these functions. As far as the sound of the unit, I thought it sounded fine and clean. Now I do have some notes I'm going to refer to my little notepad. So for the most part, the preamp worked just fine. I didn't really notice much of a difference when I switched in the Sonic Holography feature, where I normally do hear something on either my C1 or recently the CM1090 integrated amplifier. When I switched in the Sonic Holography function, I heard a difference. On this, it wasn't, I didn't really hear an expanded sound stage under the same circumstances that I normally do. So it's possible that that needs to be adjusted. I could not find the actual service manual for the 4000T, only the 4000, and it's different enough that I didn't even want to try to adjust the holographic settings inside the unit. Be that as it may, as far as a preamp, I think it does an outstanding job. You have a fair amount of inputs. I definitely wouldn't use the moving coil preamplifier stage. The moving magnet, possibly I would use depending on the quality of the turntable and cartridge that I was going to hook up to it. It did have kind of a wide variation. I think it was plus or minus a dB in the frequency response. It's not the end of the world. Depending on the turntable cartridge situation you have, this could work just fine for a moving magnet situation. I don't think I would use it as a moving coil with the additional noise that I saw on it. So some other things I noticed. When I first turned on the 4000T, for about 1 or 2 seconds, I heard a hum or a little buzz. It went away very quickly. If you were to turn on the preamp first and then turn on the power amp, you wouldn't even hear it. But it went away and it wasn't a big deal. Also, when I had the preamp turned such that the gain was all the way off, or basically the preamp was off, I could barely hear some hiss out of the tweeters on the KEF, the tweeter mid-range area. That's kind of normal. You had to have your ear right next to it, so it's not something you would hear a foot or two away, but there was a slight amount of hiss. I don't consider that a big deal whatsoever. The autocorrelator, I did switch that in and out, and it did have an effect on the highs. It reminded me of switching in the Dolby noise circuit on a tape deck. It kind of cleaned up the highs a little bit. I wouldn't use it because there is no tapis on this. I just think that's how it affects the high frequency spectrum. So the power LED, when you turn on the power, the LED comes on here. However, when you turn on the autocorrelation, the light goes off and then another one comes on. I'm not sure what's up with that, but I just thought it was weird that the power LED would go off depending on where the autocorrelation setting was. And so that is kind of overall my take on this unit. I didn't see any reason to recap the power supply caps. That hum was way down there. The majority of the THD plus noise came from higher level harmonics and so on. And it could be a capacitor somewhere in the signal chain or something else going on there. But overall, I didn't really think it detracted to my listening experience with this. Like I said, I would be more than happy to hook this up to my main 2-channel stereo system and take all the versatility it offers as far as different number of outputs and input. So once again, I thank you for taking some time out of your busy day or night for watching this review. If you like it, please click like, and if you have not subscribed to this channel, please do so, and I always welcome your comments, or so far the comments have generally been positive. A few comments haven't made any sense, but majority of the comments are positive or relating their experiences with whatever thing I have put on the chopping block, so to speak, to look at. And until next time, have a great day or night.